In a glass plate photograph from the late 19th century, three men stand on a stump so wide it looks like a platform built for them on purpose. Behind them, the hillside is not forest, it is wreckage. Trunks lie stacked like artillery, brush burns in black lines across the slope. In the distance, ridges that should be dark with timber are pale, open, almost naked. It is a familiar American landscape, and that is the problem. We were taught to picture the old continent emptying its forests, while the New World remained inexhaustibly green. But when the camera arrived, much of that green was already gone, not thinning, gone. The accepted explanation is simple enough. Settlers arrived, farms expanded, towns needed lumber. People cut trees for houses, barns, fences, firewood, ships and fields. By the late 19th century, the story goes, the damage had become obvious. Forestry emerged as a science, government stepped in, and the forests slowly returned. That account is not false. It contains the basic timeline. In the United States, forest cover fell hard through the 19th century and then stabilized. In New England, abandoned farmland grew back. In the Appalachians, federal purchase began after the Weeks Act. In the Great Lakes, the white pine era ended because the white pine was finished. And yet the official explanation feels too neat for what the record actually shows, because the photographs do not show gradual local clearing. They show extraction on a continental scale. Survey notes do not describe scattered cutting. They describe giant timber standing where giant timber no longer stands. Early conservation reports do not speak in the language of ordinary settlement. They speak of famine, denudation, watersheds stripped bare, and mountains unlocked by rail. What remains in the archives is not a story of people merely making room for farms. It is a story of industrial appetite moving faster than public memory. So the hidden theory is not that the forest disappeared in secret, or that some lost civilization removed them before history began. It is something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. It is that the great forest liquidation happened so early, so thoroughly, and for so many overlapping reasons that later generations inherited the aftermath as if it were normal. We were handed second growth landscapes, park narratives, and restored watersheds, then taught to imagine that the real destruction happened elsewhere, later or less completely than it did. What changed was the explanation. Start with the measurements. Before the saw and the skid road, eastern North America held trees that modern people mostly know from exaggeration, folklore, or tourism copy. White pines from Maine to Minnesota regularly exceeded 150 feet. Chestnut in the Appalachians rose straight for 50 feet before branching. Hemlock, tulip poplar, oak, cypress, and longleaf pine anchored entire systems that were not just older than living memory, but older than the categories we now use to describe them. The scale survives in witness tree records, land surveys, and stumps that dwarf the men standing on them. The old photographs matter because they fix proportion. An axe handle, a boot, a rail car, a horse team. The trees are not metaphorically large, they are physically immense, and once those forms disappear, the replacement forest may still look full from a distance, but it is not the same thing. The forest is present, the age is gone. Then look at the maps. In central New England, places now read as ancient woodland were in the 19th century: open fields, sheep pasture, stone-lined farms, and cut lots. The modern traveller drives through canopy and assumes continuity. The map says otherwise. So do the stone walls running deep through the woods, the cellar holes far from any modern road, the old charcoal hearths, the mill ruins stranded in second growth, and the regular geometry of property lines buried under leaf litter. The landscape is full of admissions. By the time professional forestry took hold in the northeast, many hills that feel timeless had already passed through clearing, cultivation, abandonment, and regrowth. The forest came back, but it came back altered, simplified, and younger. The record is still there. The next clue is motive, and this is where the standard story becomes too small. Agriculture cleared enormous acreage. That part is real. But agriculture alone does not explain the speed, the remoteness, or the totalizing logic of the cut. 19th century industry ran on wood in ways most people no longer imagine. Iron was smelted with charcoal across huge areas. Railroads did not just carry timber, they consumed it. Each mile of track required thousands of wooden ties, and those ties rotted and had to be replaced every few years. Bridges, trestles, depots, freight cars, telegraph poles, fences, mine props, barrels, shipyards, steam power, tanning, paper, and construction all pulled from the same living reserve. By 1900, railroads alone accounted for a significant share of national timber consumption. When people say the forests were cut for farms, they are telling only the most familiar part of the story. The deeper truth is that wood was not scenery, wood was infrastructure. Now consider terrain. If the clearing had been mainly about family farms, we would expect the pattern to favour the obvious agricultural ground and taper off where slopes became too steep, soils too thin, and transport too difficult. But the opposite often happened once industrial logging matured. In the southern Appalachians, the biggest wave came after rail penetrated the mountains. What had been inaccessible became valuable overnight. Logging shifted from selective cutting to heavy extraction supported by mills, incline railways, splash dams, cable systems, labour camps, and capital imported from far outside the region. The cut moved uphill, into coves, across watersheds, through terrain that never made much sense as farmland. That matters because it separates subsistence use from industrial removal. A mountain ridge stripped for chestnut, poplar, or hemlock is not evidence of pioneer necessity. It is evidence of a system. A fair objection appears here. Yes, the forests were cut hard, but was that really hidden? Is this not simply standard environmental history, forgotten by the average person because most people do not read forestry bulletins? That objection deserves to be taken seriously. The mainstream account does acknowledge widespread clearing, especially in the 19th century. It recognizes that eastern forests recovered substantially in the 20th. It notes that many present-day woods are second growth. All true. What it usually fails to explain is the emotional and conceptual gap between those facts and the landscapes people believe they are seeing. The public inherits phrases like wilderness, virgin forest, natural cover, and untouched mountain, even where the local record shows clear cutting, burning, grazing, chestnut blight, salvage, and repeat harvest. The mainstream explanation describes change. It often softens replacement. It tells us trees returned, but not what kind of forest failed to return with them. There is also the matter of timing. Nearly 2/3 of the net conversion of US forest land to other uses occurred in the second half of the 19th century. That is an astonishing compression. For roughly 50 years, the country was clearing forest at a rate measured not in acres per generation, but in square miles per day. When destruction is spread over centuries, memory can absorb it. When it happens in a burst, institutions struggle to narrate it honestly because the same period becomes a triumphal story of expansion, industry, settlement, and national growth. Timber moves into the ledger as output. Forest moves out of the ledger as absence. By the time children begin hearing patriotic history, the cutover phase is already being overwritten by conservation, by progress, by the next commodity boom. The pattern does not disappear, it is simply folded into a different story. Photographs sharpen this point. Study the logging scenes from Michigan, Pennsylvania, the Adirondacks, the Smokies, the Cascades, or the upper Mississippi country. Again and again, the same features appear. Mountains of slash, mud roads churned into trenches. Temporary rail lines run straight into ravines, blackened snags left after fire. Entire hillsides reduced to stump fields, then sold, burned, grazed, or abandoned. The popular image of old logging is selective and picturesque. A few men, a great tree, a river drive. The actual visual archive is closer to battlefield archaeology. And crucially, these images are not from the deep medieval past. They are from the age of cameras, newspapers, law firms, survey crews, and federal reports. This was modern enough to document in detail, yet early enough to fall outside living family memory. That is why it feels impossible. It was recorded, but it was not retained. The pattern widens when you leave a single region. New England was cut and farmed, then partially reforested. The Great Lakes lost vast white pine and then much of the mixed forest that followed. The Appalachians were entered late and cut with industrial ferocity. Longleaf pine in the south was reduced across an enormous range. On the Pacific coast, logging removed forests so large that the surviving stands now function as museum pieces for a lost scale. Move across the Atlantic and the same structure appears in older form. Many European countries had already cleared substantial portions of their original forests long before the Industrial Revolution reached full force. What modern states later managed as forest was often a reduced, regulated, replanted, or repeatedly cut remnant. Different empires, different species, same conversion of living complexity into fuel, revenue, and engineered land. The pattern repeats. Even language helps hide it. Old growth is a technical term, not a popular one. Second growth sounds healthy, even optimistic, though it can describe a forest that returned after total removal. Managed forest sounds stable, though it may mean rotation, simplification, or plantation structure. Timberland describes a living biome by its future use. Cut over land reduces a biological ruin to a real estate category. Once a forest enters administrative language, what disappears first is not the trees. It is the original condition. What matters is not whether a place is green. What matters is whether the green is continuity or replacement. A hillside can be wooded and still be evidence. Then there are the absences people mistake for nature. Why do so many eastern forests appear relatively even-aged? Why do so many stands lack the giant deadwood, layered canopy, and species composition expected of long undisturbed systems? Why are there roads, grades, charcoal pits, splash dam scars, and stone walls where visitors imagine primordial cover? Why do certain tree communities dominate now where survey records suggest a more varied pattern tied to soils, fire, altitude, and indigenous management? The answer is not mysterious once you stop thinking in snapshots. The forests remember disturbance for a very long time. The stone remembers. So does the soil. So do the species that vanish first and the species that surge after cutting, burning, and abandonment. What modern hikers often read as timeless woods are, in many places, ecological sentences written in the aftermath of removal. This is also where another layer of the story returns: indigenous land use. Before industrial extraction, many North American forests were not untouched in the simplistic sense later settlers imagined. They were managed, burned, hunted, traversed, and shaped over long time scales. That reality is sometimes used to flatten everything into a claim that all forests are equally artificial. They are not. Low-intensity stewardship, mosaic burning, and settlement-scale use are not the same as the 19th century liquidation regime. But the confusion serves a purpose. If every landscape is called altered, then no alteration seems exceptional. The distinction between inhabiting a forest and consuming it as a national material reserve becomes harder to see. The category swallows the scale. The institutional response reveals that officials understood more than later public memory suggests. By the late 19th century, terms like timber famine were already circulating. That phrase alone tells you how severe the drawdown looked to people inside the system. Federal investigations in the southern Appalachians linked destructive cutting to flooding and watershed instability. Forestry schools opened not because people suddenly discovered trees were beautiful, but because the existing model was exhausting the base material of industry. National forests in the East were often assembled from lands already logged, burned, or abused. In other words, the state did not step in before liquidation. It stepped in because liquidation had become too visible to ignore. Conservation began, in many regions, as an after-action response. And yet this does not require a dramatic conspiracy. No secret council needed to erase the story. Bureaucracy can do it. Economics can do it, regrowth can do it. A second growth canopy closes, and within 2 or 3 generations the eye forgets what stood there before. Academic disciplines separate the evidence. geology studies erosion, forestry studies stands, history studies settlement, engineering studies rail, law studies land transfer, photography sits in an archive. Local memory keeps a few place names and loses the system. Then tourism arrives and sells recovered scenery as permanence. The truth is not hidden behind a locked door, it is hidden in plain sight by fragmentation. Everyone holds a piece, almost no one is rewarded for assembling the whole. What emerges from that whole is a different chronology of modern life. The world most people imagine as ancestral forest was already, in many regions, a post-forest world before their great-grandparents were born. That does not mean the land was treeless. It means the original age structure, composition and continuity had already been broken. Families grew up under regrowth and called it normal. Conservation inherited damage and called it recovery. Education condensed centuries of extraction into a few paragraphs about settlers needing land. Even environmental memory shifted. People learned to mourn what was being cut in their own lifetime, while forgetting what had already been removed before the camera, or just before the oldest photograph in the local museum. This is why certain landscapes feel contradictory. A mountain can look ancient and still be young in forest terms. A national forest can protect a place that was once stripped. A park trail can pass through what was formerly a rail grade hauling out timber. A quiet New England wood can be younger than the stone walls inside it. None of that makes the modern forest unreal. It makes it historical. And history becomes harder to face when the surviving landscape is beautiful enough to soothe the question. People stop at the green surface. They do not ask what generation of green they are seeing. There is one more reason this matters. If a civilization forgets the scale at which it has already transformed its living systems, it also loses the ability to measure present claims of restoration. Replanting is not replacement. Coverage is not continuity. A forest map is not a time machine. When agencies announce more forest than a century ago, the statement may be statistically correct and ecologically misleading at the same time. Europe is greener in some places than it was in 1900 because abandoned farmland regrew and plantations expanded. Parts of the eastern United States are more wooded than in the era of peat clearing for the same reason. But more trees does not automatically mean more old forest, more complexity, more resilience, or more memory. What changed was the explanation. So the unsettling reframing is this: the great disappearance was not just the loss of trees, it was the loss of a baseline. Once the baseline is gone, every later generation mistakes inheritance for origin. They see forest and assume ancient continuity. They see recovery and assume the damage was limited. They see conservation boundaries and assume the protected object is what was always there. But the archival record says otherwise. The maps say otherwise. The survey notes, flood reports, stump fields, rail grades, witness trees, and agency language all point in the same direction. The forests most people imagine as the old world were, in many places, already memory by the time family memory begins. And that leaves a harder question than simple nostalgia. Not whether logging happened, not whether farms expanded, not whether trees returned, those things are all documented. The real question is why this transformation, one of the largest material reorganizations of land in modern history, was reduced in public memory to background scenery and a few sentimental stories about pioneers, conservation, and the outdoors. The record is still there. The pattern does not disappear. The real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.